Hi, I'm Laura Mullen, co-founder of Bent Paddle Brewing Company in Duluth, Minnesota. Here at Bent Paddle, we make quality craft beer and hemp cannabis beverages from the clean water of Lake Superior. On your way up to the BWCA, be sure to check out our Lincoln Park Craft District tap room to get a stainless steel or growler to go, or find Bent Paddle at restaurants, bars, and liquor stores throughout Minnesota. Let Bent Paddle be the bridge that lets good memories and conversation flow while you're reflecting on the perfect campsite or the splendidness of the Northern Lights. For more info, visit bentpaddlebrewing.com or check us out on Facebook or Instagram. Cheers!
Welcome to winter on the Paddle and Portage podcast.
It was about this time last year, Joe Fredericks, that Gwen Danfelt went through the ice. Early season ice skating, alone, nearly lost her life. Shortly thereafter, also Brady Powers. Powerful stories that we told on this podcast.
Episode 2, if you want to go back and listen. It's still to this day the most listened to episode that we've ever produced on the podcast, of which there are now many episodes. But episode 2, if you want to hear those stories.
I think my personal proximity and involvement being present in part of Gwen's story and this happening so close to home with folks that we know, it really kicked off a very different, at least for me, a different orientation for the rest of the year to being on the ice. A lot more fear and a lot more caution. Did you experience that?
I usually have a pretty cautious approach to the start of the, for me, ice fishing season.
It certainly propelled me into a process of questioning. There's reasons why both of them went through, and there's reasons why anybody breaks through the ice. I want to understand that, and I want other people to understand it, and this episode is really, I think, an attempt for us to dive into trying to make sense of what's happening with the ice and how do we make some sort of peace with it. Eric Glasson lives in Ely. We've heard his stories on Paddle and Portage before. He has been traveling the regional lakes for 7 years, winter camping, skiing, snowshoeing, primarily in pursuit of lake trout. Prior to that, he was chasing fish on the ice further south in the state of Minnesota. He's learned a lot of valuable lessons in that time.
Fortunately, I've spent a lot of time on the ice, and as you mentioned, I've only taken 2 dips. Fortunately, those were just, not even up to my waist, so in one of those scenarios, I stepped through some thin ice and one of my feet went through and it just got wet up to the ankle. It was very cold out. It was dark and cold and darkness was approaching, so it was nerve-wracking. Luckily, that one did not end up being a threatening situation. The other one, I was skiing across a lake and fell through up to my knees, a little bit past my knees to my thighs, and that one was a little scarier. Even though I hit bottom, I was by some structure in between 2 islands. It was scary because I had backcountry skis on and one of my skis got hooked under the ice. So I kind of panicked for a little bit before I was able to get out. I also had a sled attached to my back. I'm pretty sure I had a backpack on. So very fortunately, that one was close to shore and my skis hit bottom, but it was still a very creepy experience.
LynnAnne Vesper has been guiding canoe and dog sledding trips in Ely for over 20 years. She genuinely loves the place and has a deep respect for the ways the Anishinaabe have sustained themselves in the region. As a senior in college, she accomplished a Quetico crossing on skis with dog sled support as part of Paul Shirkey's winter expedition, January term course.
Yes, I think that the immediate thing that attracted me to winter was that it doesn't feel like you should be able to do it. like the whole concept of sleeping out in a sleeping bag at 20 below, it just seems incomprehensible. Like how do you even stay comfortable? And when I woke up my first morning in the Quetico, it was probably only 0 degrees or so, but I realized that I had had a pretty good night's sleep. I was like, wow, this is amazing.
Though LynnAnne obviously has years of valuable experience on the ice, even she has gone through a complicated journey of figuring out how to feel safe.
At Wintergreen, on the first night, we asked people, like, what are you concerned about and what are you most looking forward to? And many people, their concern revolved around, is the ice safe to go on? Because they come from all over the country, and in many places, like, they look out over an expanse of white and, well, that's a field. Well, like, no, that's a lake. Or they come from a place where if there's ice on a river or a lake, you just don't go on it. It's just never safe. And so for them to be out on the lakes here, it was kind of a mind warp for them. And so people would sometimes ask the guides, like, well, how do you know if the ice is safe? It's like, well, I don't know. It's been 20 below for the last 2 weeks. It's probably safe. We didn't really have a good answer, And so I set myself a personal challenge one spring, was to go out on the ice as it was rotting. I took a canoe and a pair of dog sled runners, and I went out on the ice with the canoe and the canoe on runners. And I set myself a challenge to find out, like, how do you know if the ice is safe? I set this challenge to fall through the ice repeatedly, but not get wet. So I was out there from like April 15th through the 30th in the Boundary Waters. I forget what year it was, probably 2003 or so. And so I learned a lot about what it takes to fall through the ice. And I just have to preface some of my words with, don't take my lessons as your lessons. Like, everybody needs to feel comfortable with their own risk taking. But what I learned on that trip was that the ice is a lot more weight bearing than you expect. Like, there were many times where I thought, okay, I'm going to fall through the ice on my next step, and I didn't. But I started testing the ice. I had a ski pole, a couple of ski poles. I used my ski pole. I have a pair of aluminum ski poles. I switched over from fiberglass to aluminum, and so they're a bit stronger. So I'm not sure if regular ski poles, if you could do this, but I would take the ski pole and smack the ice, so just like point pressure. And I learned if I could punch through the ice in 7, like, I was hitting the ice pretty hard with the ski pole. If I went through if I could get up to 7 punches without going through, then my next step, I probably wasn't going to go through either. But if I went through the ice with my ski pole in under 7 punches, then I might go through on my next step. So I was wearing knee-high rubber boots, so they were Tingley boots over my mucklucks. And so I could go in up to my knees and not get wet, or up to my mid-shin. So I did punch through many times, but then I would just end up sitting on the bow of the canoe. Yes, this is like my research project. I was like, I want to get a master's degree in understanding ice safety. Yeah. So that was my little research project.
Support for this episode comes from Voyageur Canoe Outfitters, located at the end of the Gunflint Trail in Grand Marais. Voyageur outfits your Boundary Waters trip with as much or as little gear as needed. From fully furnished cabins near the Wilderness Line to complete outfitting canoe trips, Voyageur has you covered. Head to VoyageurOutfitters.com to book your vacation. And support for Paddle and Portage comes from Ely Outfitting Company. Located in downtown Ely, their friendly and knowledgeable team shares expert Boundary Waters trip planning and routing advice. Ely Outfitting Company offers complete outfitting services, lightweight canoe rentals, and professionally guided tours. Plan your Boundary Waters trip now at EleyOutfittingCompany.com. Successful Boundary Water canoe trips start with Eley Outfitting Company.
How do you know if the ice is safe? That's the question that propelled LynnAnne onto her late season ice trip. And that's the question I posed to Eric Glasson as well.
For me, I'm really careful up here, even more so than where I grew up in central Minnesota, just because we have so many more factors. And what I mean by that, central Minnesota is a bunch of pothole lakes and farm country. There isn't lakes, rivers, bogs, moving water, essentially connecting those areas. So there are fewer factors to consider. Up here, we've got unlimited variables. You've got animals moving to and fro. You've got otters, beavers, and muskrats that have to come up for air, that spend a lot of their time underwater, but they need breathe holes. They need to maintain those and keep those open. So those are hazards to look for. Inflows and outflows of rivers, I've mentioned. Anywhere where friction of water under the ice exists is going to wear away that ice. So that water can still be incredibly cold, but still act as a melting agent, which obviously will fluctuate when river levels rise and lower. And then also just literal structure. Both instances where I put my foot through the ice happened between two islands. So two islands, very shallow in between those islands, surrounded by really deep water. The best way I can describe it is like a beating heart. When you have water entering and exiting a lake system, it fluctuates like a beating heart. So, one day you could have significant ice between those two islands, enough to walk on 4 to 6 inches. And then you get some rain or some melt in the spring, especially, and the water levels rise and water moves in between those islands and wears away at the ice. So those are the areas I look for, and the areas that have caused me pain in the past where I've gone through, fortunately, without any negative repercussions other than wet feet.
Over the years, primarily while skating wild ice, I've been told time and again to avoid beaver lodges. The best explanation I can get is the ice isn't solid. While talking to Pete Brautigam at the Winter Camping Symposium, he took a deep dive into explaining the phenomenon from his perspective.
Being an avid trapper, avid water trapper of beaver, you'll see a lodge, and lodges are pretty obvious to see. They're kind of difficult to see in a wind-blown lodge, or a lodge would be hard to see in a wind-blown cove. Outside of those lodges, there's a handful of at least 2. There's always more than that sometimes, maybe 3, maybe 4 runs. And what a run is a well-traveled route that the beaver use to move around their feed pile and into their other bank dens, because they'll have a lodge and a series of other bank dens. And these runs, through erosion with their travel and their, them moving in and out, they'll create these very steep, sometimes 10 feet deep troughs, and these runs that are a little bit wider than the beaver. They're about 2 to almost 3 feet wide to the bank den or to the lodge until it gets really deep, and then you don't have them anymore. But they're very dangerous around beaver activity areas, even old beaver activity. So what happens is these beaver runs, when they travel, it's turbulent water. So even though the ice still will be there, it'll always
under the ice.
It's under the ice.
Oh, it's where they're traveling under the ice.
Yes.
And they're creating turbulence from their motion.
Yes, and they're doing it a couple times a day. So when it's really thin ice in the fall or early winter, there's going to be no ice there. And then it'll finally ice over when it gets cold enough, but it'll never be as thick as the nominal lake ice in the rest of the lake. They're dangerous. They make a different sound, and they're not obvious. And that's when I saw that dip in the snow. That's when there was no snow there until it got cold enough. And that dip, and I bet you that ice wasn't an inch thick, but everything else was over 20. It was wild. So, and even old lodges have no active beavers in there. they moved on, nothing around. Those runs still kind of exist for depth, not so much activity. So they'll still be thicker ice, but it'll be abnormally deeper there. So yeah, but they're really dangerous on active beaver lodges.
Turbulent water. The phenomenon has come up again and again. Before we get into it, Pete took a plunge into the icy boundary waters and shared the tale in an earlier episode. But here he mentions turbulence. We often hear about it in the air while flying, but it occurs in water too. And turbulence, by its very nature, is unpredictable. Like chaos, we may be able to predict its presence, but we can't predict its action.
Quick break in the episode. LB, where are you heading in March?
I'm headed lots of places in March, but specifically the weekend of March 7th through the 9th, I'll be with you actually at Canoecopia.
Canoecopia 2025. Get your tickets now. They're available now, like right now in the holiday season. And book your lodging accommodations, plan your trip to Madison for Canoecopia 2025. It's coming up, and we'll see you there.
It's the largest. Are we done? Is that it? That was 30 seconds. Oh yeah, we'll see you there. Good. That was good. You can just cut the rest of that out. In an attempt to get some hopeful information on ice, Joe and I turned to a scientist. Not just any scientist. Joe talked to John Downing, the director of Minnesota Sea Grant, which serves Minnesotans who need water science. We thought that maybe, just maybe, an institution that studies water could give us some hope.
How do you tell if ice is safe? It never is. You never are sure. And I've been on lakes where you'll have 3 feet of ice, and other places on that lake where you've got a few inches. And it kind of depends on how the water's moving underneath it. And there's so many different things that change how that ice forms and how strong it is. And I think one of the important things for people to remember is that when you're standing on ice, you're asking that ice to act like a boat and float you. So it's by displacement of the ice that it's actually floating you on top. It's not due to the strength of the ice particularly, but obviously the thicker it is and more crystalline it is, the stronger it is. People say, is the ice safe? I say no. Be careful, because there are always variations in ice thickness wherever you are. And if you cut a hole in the ice and you find it is 3 feet thick in one place, it could be 2 feet, 1 foot, 4 inches, other places. The differences in texture and visual differences in ice should be paid attention to. And during the day, you've got this ice cover, the sun hits it, and especially if there's not much snow, then what it's going to do is it's expanding. Water is the coolest stuff. It behaves differently from almost any other molecule. In that, so as you warm it, it can actually, it'll expand quite a lot. And I've done the calculations. It's in my ice article. But if you've got a mile expanse of ice, even if you expand it, say 1%. That's 1% of a mile, basically, that it's going to try to expand. And if it's got nowhere to go, then it's going to crack. Something's got to give. And so you get that booming sound under there. And sometimes shattering sounds. And it depends. But then again, it gets cold at night, and it's going to make similar kinds of sounds as it contracts again, right? There's just not a lot of play in the surface of a lake. And so... And that cracking, if you had a lot of expansion, contraction, the ice is going to be affected by that because you've got fractures across it. And I've seen water upwelling through cracks and stuff watching ice in the wintertime. I recommend that people, if they're going to be on ice, carry carry a hypothermia kit with them. I mean, but if you're out in boundary waters, who's going to help you? You got to be ready yourself. And I think if I were going out in boundary waters, I wouldn't go without proper preparation, knowing what I'm getting into. I am careful around ice, and it's never safe. I mean, even in the depths of winter.
Hi, I'm Ingrid Lyons. I'm the executive director of Save the Boundary Waters, and I'm that person who sends you way too many emails. But also, if you don't get our emails, you should probably go sign up. Save the Boundary Waters is a proud sponsor of Paddle and Portage. We work to protect canoe country so that folks can paddle in portage in northeastern Minnesota for generations to come. Did you know that the Boundary Waters is America's most visited wilderness? Not only is it one of the country's most iconic and unique landscapes, but its 1.1 million acres of lakes and boreal forests offers something for everyone. People have long found inspiration and strength in the Boundary Waters, and now the wilderness needs you to speak loudly on its behalf. The future of this special place is at risk, threatened by America's most toxic industry, copper mining. Thanks for reading all the emails from us. I know we send a lot, but clearly there's a lot at stake for canoe country. You can make a difference. You already have. Join us in the effort to protect the Boundary Waters for generations to come by visiting our website at savetheboundarywaters.org to learn more.
Taking a step on the ice is an endeavor into the study of consistency versus change. Mathematically, it's a calculation of turbulence intensity, which represents the ratio of the fluctuating velocity component to the mean velocity, essentially indicating how much variation exists relative to the overall flow. But that doesn't mean much to most people. In the social sciences, stability and change are opposing forces that can be balanced with proper management. As social creatures, living in relationship to our surroundings, it's with this attitude that we must approach the ice.
A cautionary tale that you always have to check ice thickness. And all of these hazards are made infinitely more difficult to identify when there's snow on the surface of the lake. So those breathe holes I mentioned earlier from those animals, or the thin spots, those are relatively easy in a wild ice type year when you have absolutely no snow cover. Everything froze when it was not windy, when it was very calm. Those hazards are easy to identify. The one time that I went through that I mentioned, or one of the times I went through just up to my ankle, I could see that the ice was thinner in between those islands, and I chanced it. I stepped closer to the shore. I was kind of tiptoeing on rocks, and where I went through was a relatively safe place to go through. But if I hadn't had that visibility, if all of that snow or all of that ice had been covered by that snow, I might have walked right down the middle. And then I'm looking at water that's 4 to 5 feet deep instead of water that's, 6 to 8 inches deep. So that could have been a situation that turned life-threatening immediately. Luckily, it didn't, because I was able to, partially identify that risk. So, yeah, the inability to see these hazards is something you should assume if we've got any snow out there. So a spud bar or an auger is key. Anytime before really mid-January, I have a spud bar with me, and every 4 feet I'm checking the thickness, and I'm hitting that thing as hard as I can. And if any water gushes up, I back up. That means, the ice is not thick enough to withstand the weight of me, my sled, whoever's with me, my dog, all that stuff. So tools are necessary. And the DNR says about 4 inches of clear, uniform, good ice without cloud, not choppy, like good black ice is the minimum you need to walk by yourself on ice. So that's a good starting point. If it ever breaks through at less than 2.5, then you need to back up immediately.
Like, if you think about the elements of risk, like what goes into taking risks, and it's really, if you boil it down to a mathematical equation, it's the probability times the consequences. And so when I'm out there, I'm constantly weighing those two things, like what's the worst case scenario and what's the likelihood of that coming to pass. So I think it's important for people to understand those two elements, like what could happen and am I prepared to deal with it?
One of my friends, you know, I teased him for being overly cautious one time on a canoe trip, and he's like, what's the point of going on these trips if you end up dying? You're never going to get to go on another one of these trips. So as overly cautious as we appear to be, like, no trip is worth risking your life. That's just a fact. So if you want to keep doing these things well into retirement, as I do, you literally have to keep yourself alive. And this area, as dark as it sounds, has taken a lot of people, and disproportionate amounts of those people as a percentage of travelers has happened in the winter due to exposure. A lot of that has been exposure to water and the elements. So for me, it's, I got a family. It makes sense to be overly cautious. It would be dumb, to ever go out on my last trip and not come back.
Yeah, and I think if you think about, like, you also have to consider, like, aging. Like, everybody gets a year older every year. But as we age, like, you think about, like, sometimes the fatalities that we hear about are these old guys who've spent their entire lives out ice fishing, and they take one wrong step and all of a sudden they're in the ice and they didn't have their ice picks with them or whatever, and they can't get out, and all you find is their hat floating. And so that can be really tragic if you think about it too hard. So it's important to realize that, like, yeah, my abilities aren't what they were 10, 20 years ago. So I have to continually reevaluate my risk taking.
The reality of the situation when it comes to ice in the Boundary Waters, anywhere in Minnesota, anywhere around the Great Lakes, anywhere that there's ice in North America or anywhere in the world, is that you never know when the ice is going to give out. And that's the risk you take every time you set foot, ski, blade, snowshoe on the ice.
We have talked to several different people for this episode to try to figure out if that is true, then how can we approach the ice with some degree of intelligent discretion that keeps us safe but keeps us out there.
When we talk about themes like this where there's a risk or a danger involved, I don't think we need to preface it always with, yeah, but get out there and enjoy it still. You can still have fun. Like the stuff when we talk about search and rescue on the podcast or bad weather in the Boundary Waters and the canoe open water season. I don't think we have to also say, but you can still have a great trip. For some reason with ice, though, I feel a little more inclined to do that. And I'm not sure why. Because I don't want people to be terrified of the ice. Even though it's a possibility you could go in at any time, there's just inherent risk in doing these sorts of activities around the Boundary Waters. But for some reason, I do feel this notion to say, I hope you still have fun, yeah. Winter camping or ice fishing or ice skating, skiing on the lakes, whatever it is you're doing, you can still do it. I mean, people get out there every month in the winter and do these types of activities that we're talking about. People are out there. We're out there, for crying out loud, all the time.
Yes. I think the whole idea of this is, yes, get out there, and yes, do it with confident caution. Go with people who know if you don't know. And also, when you're with people who know, or if you are the person who knows, remember that even what you know could fail you. And with that in mind, have a ball.
Exactly. In fact, I'm late. I got an ice fishing appointment that I need to get to right now.
Absolutely.
So
get out of here.
I'm
Freddie.
headed out now. It's early ice. I'm gonna go out with this caution that you're talking about and do it safely. Drill the holes, even though I've been out now once already extensively. Like, still going to take our time, do it right, and enjoy the beautiful season up here.
Bring us back an ice report.
Yeah, and some fish, hopefully.